Good evening, everybody. It's just a little after 7 on my clock, so I think we'll make a start. Welcome along to our Royal Scottish Forestry Society online talk this evening. It's wonderful to have you all here for what promises to be a fascinating topic. I'm Kat Wilson, the Executive Director of RSFS, and I'm delighted for us to be hosting the next in our Forest Lights speaker series. And as ever, if you have any feedback on the format or ideas for future topics, you can always email me at director@rsfs.org.uk. If you're new to RSFS, a particularly warm welcome this evening. It's great to have you with us. If you'd like to find out more about what we do and events you're welcome to join us at, please look at our website. In terms of the format for this evening, we aim for these to be relatively informal events. If a question comes to you whilst Joseph is speaking, you can type it in the chat box, or else wait until the end when we'll have time for a Q&A. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Joseph Hawes for this evening's talk. Joe's a senior lecturer in ecology and conservation at the University of Cumbria and teaches at the National School of Forestry there. His PhD focused on floodplain forest ecology in the Brazilian Amazon, and subsequent postdoc research has included investigating the consequences of forest disturbance on fruit traits and seed dispersal. And today he's going to tell us all about his current work in the ongoing Amazon biodiversity and carbon expeditions, and will therefore transport us from a dark Scottish Monday evening into the remarkable surrounds of two contrasting forests in the Brazilian Amazon. So over to you, Joe. I'll stop sharing my screen and hopefully you can share your screen and take it from there.
Thank you very much, Kat, for that introduction. I hope you can all hear me well. Even if you can't see, I'm a bit nervous about my connection because it's just, having been fine all day, just dropped out a couple of times in the last couple of minutes. So I've just changed connection and hopefully that works okay for you. Please let me know if it's not working for whatever reason. I'm just trying to share the correct screen with you. That's the one I want to share. So hopefully you're seeing the start of that slideshow. And perhaps, Kat, you can give me a thumbs up to let you know that you're hearing me okay?
Yep, that's great, Joe. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, I'll continue in that case. And Kat's just done the introduction for me, so I don't need to say anything else there. As I said, as she said, working at the University of Cumbria, based in Ambleside. Thank you very much for that introduction. And so just to give you a sort of outline of what I'll cover over the next, going on for an hour, a little introduction firsthand on, background context on the Amazon. I realize it might be rather different forest context than most of you are used to. So I'll start with that. And then, as Kat described, a couple of examples that relate. I will talk about those Amazon biodiversity and carbon expeditions sort of in that beginning context, but the two contrasting examples that I'm going to present relate to the studies that Kat mentioned of my PhD in the Western Amazon, which was looking at the difference between seasonally flooded and unflooded forests, and some of my postdoc work, which was looking at the effects of disturbance, different disturbances, logging and fire, for example, on different plant traits. So sort of contrasts within contrasts there. So to start with, I'm sure you all are well aware of the Amazon being rather more diverse than the forests we have in our immediate surroundings here, the world's most diverse rainforest, and yet it's not homogeneous. We often think of tropical rainforests being the most diverse settings, but obviously there's variation within that, as can be seen in this recent summary that sort of nicely shows some of the patterns of diversity across a region as large and as varied as the Amazon is. And despite that great richness throughout tropical rainforests and the wealth of different plant and animal taxa that there are there, it's unequally explored in terms of the amount of scientific research that's being conducted. And so this is another sort of recent study that shows some of the variation. Obviously, those sites closest to major towns, closest to major access routes, the easiest places to get to, tend to have been studied rather better than some of those more remote, more distant sites. And that doesn't necessarily correspond, in fact, correlates quite poorly to the amount of richness. So it tends to be those sites that are got the richest species diversity that tend to be the least well studied, least well explored. And of course, again, as we're all well aware, the Amazon, along with forests around the world, face multiple threats in terms of deforestation, and you can see part of that relates to those access routes, particularly that southern arc of deforestation along the southern and eastern margins of the Amazon forest. That sort of you can see relate to those red areas on the map on the right, where there's more studies closer to human populations. And so some of my work, including these Amazon biodiversity and carbon expeditions that were mentioned, are aiming to tackle these deficits in research. And we've done with a bit large team of Brazilian universities, but led by the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and the University of East Anglia, in fact, this series of expeditions, multi-taxa biodiversity assessments, including mammals, birds, reptiles, invertebrates, and the plants and trees that I think my audience tonight might be most interested in, but obviously it all goes together. And importantly, making sure that our coverage goes to some of those most remote, least studied sites across the Amazon, and tries to capture some of that variation that you get in the different regions. So highlighted here in those different colors are the different endemic regions, which have noticeably different flora and fauna across those major boundaries, often delineated by the major tributaries of the River Amazon. So this is our sort of current status, having had it started in 2019. So we had a sort of 3 or 4 years of expeditions going on during that period. So those orange sites, we have a number of sites where we're planning to do future expeditions where we can continue some of this work, but we've got a reasonable spread of sites, but some additional sites on our wish list that we'd like to get to still. And just to say that in addition to that range of different taxonomic groups, we employ a range of different methods, albeit within a standardized set of protocols that we're using to explore within a sort of 10-15 day window when we can rapidly go and assess these. So we use traditional techniques, including tree plot surveys for the vegetation, understory, including ferns, and then mist nets for birds, transect surveys for large mammals, pitfall traps for invertebrates, but also audio moths, camera trapping, eDNA from the rivers, and from insect DNA from carrion flies and dung beetles to be able to really comprehensively sample the biodiversity at each of these sites. As you might imagine, that's quite a large undertaking, and most of our results are not fully out yet, but we have some exciting sort of single species studies that have come out so far, including this one rather recently, which just focuses on a single set of images, video footage from a single camera trap that I'm going to let you explore the link there, which takes you to the paper, and you can find in that a rather nice video of an intimate moment between 2 jaguars that's very rarely spotted. So it just shows some of the sort of additional, might not be our original aims of this study, but some additional behavioral footage that can be really valuable. So that's a recent study there led by Thomas Lupayet, who is a PhD student and now postdoc at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And I've borrowed these next couple of slides from Professor Torbjørn Haugersen, who leads the expeditions from that Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And as I said, most of those data are still under the process of identification and analysis. Some of the best studies groups and the ones that are most advanced in terms of the identification of the dung beetles. And we've got a couple of papers out on dung beetles already, but just to illustrate the sampling effort that has gone into this study, over 36,000 dung beetles collected, producing about 345 species, about 100 of which may be new to science. And so it just demonstrates this severe lack of sampling that's being conducted in many of these remote sites, and a group such as the dung beetles are really important at representing that, showing the importance of studies in these sites. As I said, we've got other samples as well beyond the pitfall traps for dung beetles, and so we've collected many other Coleoptera, obviously one of the most diverse animal groups that we could be using to sample, and really important indicators of other groups, including large mammals. So very important for biodiversity assessments. The trees and plants, which I was sort of leading in terms of these expeditions at the beginning, conducting the tree plot surveys with a team of experts and collecting samples which were being deposited mainly at INPA, the Amazonian Institute for Research, Amazonian Research. And most of those plant samples are unfortunately still in the process of identification. It's quite a long process, and when we've got such a large sample, we're dealing with the conditions in terms of transport and a shortage of experts and people to work on this. We're battling away with it and inputting the data, but samples from over 30,000 trees from those expeditions to date, and covering at least 281 genera of trees from across 68 families. So the diversity is quite overwhelming at times, but we're making our way through it, and hopefully we'll have some results to be able to share from this shortly. But that's the reason why I'm not quite presenting results from that study yet. So what I would like to present is work from the Western Amazon. So this is the site, just to start with, before I move to that eastern site. So you can see the yellow star indicating the location here. And this is along the Juruá River, which is one of the tributaries coming into the main Amazon Solimões River, and was the location of my PhD between 2008, 2012. And I'm putting this slide here to show Instituto Juruá, which is a current Brazilian NGO, which is based in the site, that's built on the work conducted during my PhD and other students' PhDs in the region. We then aimed to set up an NGO, a Brazilian NGO led by Brazilians, focused on the actions of people principally within two reserves, but extending beyond them. These are two sustainable development or extractive reserves that very much have a focus on the sustainable management of natural resources, including timber and non-timber resources, and aiming to combine these ideas of conservation with local livelihoods in particular. So we have a lot of work ongoing with trees, and indeed with plant traits, which I'm going to be describing shortly, and with frugivore networks, which I've got a particular interest in. So there's several PhD students currently from Spain who are working on a project looking at that. But Instituto Juruá focuses more broadly as well on other conservation issues, including this management of aquatic resources. Pirarucu, the arapaima, the largest scaled freshwater fish in the world, and including freshwater turtles, so covering a range of species that are of major importance to local people, and have been demonstrated to be very successful in generating financial opportunities, cash earning opportunities for people who have otherwise very restricted opportunities for earning money. And through that, we're sort of hoping that contributes to providing livelihood opportunities that don't rely upon the clear felling of forest, for example, in comparison to the pressures from cattle ranching and agriculture elsewhere in the Amazon. So we see it as a very sort of positive example, and whilst it might not immediately seem related to the conservation of tree species, there's definitely that link in terms of providing food that comes from a sustainable source. And work within that group has also demonstrated the value of those protected areas and how they can contribute towards conservation, but also income generation, reduced inequality, and some of those other socioeconomic benefits for local people living within those regions. So just an example of some of the work that Instituto Juruá is doing, but I just wanted to provide that as a sort of background context for the location where I was going to be describing this next study, which is the Médio Juruá or Mid Juruá region. So an extremely long tributary. You know, the scale of everything in the Amazon is rather different than we're used to here. So just restricted to that middle portion of the river. And sort of a really important site to demonstrate some of this variation that you get between different forest types, even within a single region in the Amazon, particularly because of the sort of the aquatic landscape that comes into play. And so these Amazonian floodplain forests are a really unique and distinctive forest type that you get within the Amazon. But indeed, they're split within different types, and there are other variations on these floodplain forests that flood naturally and seasonally in accordance to changing river levels, which I'll describe in a moment. But there are categories within these types of floodplain forests, the two most important of which are this distinction between whitewater and blackwater. And this image here shows that quite clearly. This is the meeting of the waters, or Encontro das Águas, at Manaus, the capital city of the state of Amazonas, in Manaus, so where the Rio Solimões, the main Amazon river that's the sort of browny color, that's the white water, and the Rio Negro coming from the north meet at Manaus, and they travel then for miles downriver once they've joined forces as the main Amazon from Manaus onwards, before those waters eventually mix. So this is a sort of permanent fixture in Manaus. You can get a tourist boat out to be able to have your boat go back and forth between the black and white waters. You can jump out for a swim and notice the temperature difference as you swim between the two bodies of water that travel sort of side by side for some time. So just to be clear, so the black water there is clearer. It's coming from highland areas, and it has sort of high tannin load, which gives it that black color, whereas the white water is that more sort of milky coffee color, muddy brown, and that's carrying high sediment load from the Andes, and that gives it that really silty color, and obviously very different water chemistry and impacts on the forest type when it then floods. So the Juruá is obviously coming downriver from the Andes, from Peru, and therefore is one of those whitewater rivers, in contrast to the Rio Negro, which comes more from the headwaters within from towards Colombia, Venezuela, and the other sort of blackwater rivers come from the Guyanan headlands or from the Brazilian Shield instead. And so this is the region sort of midway along that river, within the municipality of Caruarí, where I was conducting my PhD research. And I've highlighted on this map the two reserves that I just mentioned a moment ago. You can see how meandering this river is. As it goes through the floodplain forest in its sort of lower reaches, in a way, even at this stage. And here we have an image superimposed on that, which is showing elevation, but reflects quite nicely the blue color there, more or less corresponds to the seasonal flooding that occurs in the region. So that's the extent, stretching kilometers across from side to side, that flood completely every year as you get increased water flow down from the Andes, primarily driven by ice melt, snow melt in the Andes rather than precipitation locally. And so you get these two very contrasting forest types. The unflooded terra firma, terra firme in Portuguese, terra firma forests, unflooded forests on the higher reaches further away from the main river channel, and then closer to the river channel in the floodplain, the current floodplain. You can see that it's there's a sort of paler green there that shows, the historic movement of that river across the channel, and so there's a slight gradient there. Much of what is currently unflooded might be described more accurately as paleovasia, and it has flooded in the past, and it's the much higher reaches would really be described as terra firma, truly. But then you have these seasonally flooded forests, which can be flooded for 5, 6, 7 meters in depth for about half the year, for 5 or 6 months of the year. And so obviously that has quite severe impacts on the forest type. So you can see a description here of the water level across the year. So, and this is water level in the main river channel, and you can see some of the photos of that's the same individual tree with some of these adapted roots for the conditions, and demonstrating. So you'll be conducting surveys in the dry season and walking along the forest floor, and then in the same site you'll be doing all of your work by dugout canoe, going through essentially the canopies of the trees. The photo in the top right shows the dry season conditions where you get exposed beaches along the insides of the meanders, and the old oxbow lakes, floodplain lakes, become isolated. But in the wet season, everything that you see there will, the forest canopy will still be above it, but you could basically canoe or paddle through that entire forest landscape. So this annual inundation is often described as the Amazon flood pulse. It's really, you do get seasonal flooding in other tropical forests, but this is perhaps the most widespread extreme example. You get this extended submersion, waterlogging of the soil, reduced photosynthesis for plants, including seedlings that are trying to establish themselves and then are submerged by months underwater. So really extreme conditions for the plant communities to be adapted to. And you can see that flood pulse varies across the Amazon. So the timing of it depends on where you are along different tributaries of the Amazon. The intensity, the severity of the flood pulse changes. So it's a really interesting phenomenon that has quite profound implications for the plant communities in any particular site. These are just a few images of what that means in terms of field work. So very beautiful landscapes, but also very testing field conditions, particularly in the rising and falling periods where you're not quite so easy to paddle straight into the forest and you have to drag your canoe or wade through rather swampy areas at different depths. You have the old levees of past meanders, making conditions quite variable. It's relatively flat topography, but you have these slight inundations, changes in topography that influence the level of inundation, level of flooding, and some of that sort of fine scale differences in the amount of waterlogging have implications for the plant community as well. So I was interested in exploring the differences in the plant community for my PhD, and I did this by setting up semi-permanent plots, basically, to be able to explore these. So small 0.1 hectare plots, so 10 meters by 100 meters in a series along transects, and 100 of these plots within the flooded Varzea forests. So Varzea indicated by VZ in these plots, in these figures, and 100 equivalent plots in terra firma, so the TF on those plots. And I was interested in looking at above ground biomass and other measures of forest structure to be able to assess carbon stocks and to be able to assess productivity in these two different forest types. And you can see from these graphs that so above ground biomass is the middle plot, so that's probably the most interesting to look at. You get slightly higher above ground biomass in terra firma than in Varzea, and most of that is influenced by wood specific gravity. So this is one of these traits, wood density, that varies in response to these flood conditions. So the density of the wood is obviously related to the speed of growth that you get within these forest types. So the Varzea forest with this flooding, high level of silt deposition from that muddy brown water leads to very unstable soils, and you get a much shorter canopy. Trees are much more likely to fall over, so you get a higher incidence of gaps. It's essentially a much more of a live fast, die young system, where you have much more of that fast growth and therefore lower density trees. And so that relates then to the above ground biomass that you have within those sites. You do get some very large trees despite that within there, but those are sort of fewer in relation to the large numbers of small, quick growing tree species that you get within those sites. So as I said, there was, in addition to that sort of main comparison between those two sites, I was able to look in more depth. So those points on this next plot indicate those individual 100 plots in each forest type, and by measuring based on satellite imagery and elevation maps, I could record the exact elevation of those plots, in particular in relation to the water level in the main river channel, and assess the impact that might have on wood density in particular. And so you can see some interesting variation. Generally lower wood density, as I was saying, in the flooded Varzea forests, but within them, interestingly, you get a higher wood density the greater amount of time that they've been underwater rather than the reverse. So a slight increase in wood density within those flooded plots in the slightly deeper sites that are flooded for longer throughout the year. So it's quite interesting to see that variation. My surveys that I did during my PhD were then followed up by a subsequent PhD student based at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, in fact, Jenny Breddin, and she looked in more detail at those plots. I based most of my work using wood density values that were taken from the literature, from databases, rather than sampling themselves. And so Jenny added some work where she was able to collect wood density samples from the trees themselves. She also improved on the identification, the taxonomic resolution of the identification that was conducted on those plots through more sampling of the plant specimens and depositing in the herbarium in INPA, and was able to look then in more depth at the community composition. So we see higher species richness. You can see the accumulation curves with increased sampling. Obviously, the number of species you record increases. So those curves in the left-hand panel show that increasing picking up of new species as you sample more and more. But interestingly, you can see that terra firma sites are, on average, as you go further along will tend to have more species richness than you do in Vasia sites, but obviously quite incredible species richnesses in general. So we're reaching 600 or so species in Terra Firme and 500 or so in Vasia, and obviously those curves have not reached their leveling off, their asymptotes yet, and so would have many more. You can also see, for those of you interested in sort of the composition there, the 10 most common species in Terra Firme in orange and Vasia in blue, those tables in the middle, and the sort of the plant families that they correspond to. So a high dominance in the in Terra Firme of the Lecythidaceae, so that's the family that includes the Brazil nut tree, although they're quite rare within the Juruá region, the mid-Juruá region at least. Yeah, and I think, yeah, the main point that I wanted to say is that the right-hand panel here, that despite high diversity, species richness in both sites, what we get is a really distinct community composition. So the plot on the right is an NMDS plot, non-metric multi-dimensional scaling, which sounds very complicated, but is basically looking at the similarity of species within those different communities. And any 2 points on that plot, if they're closer together to each other, that means that they're more similar in terms of the species that are present there and the relative abundances of all of those different species. So you can see this clear separation between the communities that you get in the two forest types. Interestingly, these can often be congeners, so they can be species that are within the same genus, but have evolved separately into two distinct species that occur within these two forest types that exist side by side within a few kilometers of each other, and yet highly distinct because of the influence of that flood regime on their community. Okay, looking at timing, and I best speed myself up. So I was also interested beyond that carbon stocks and above ground biomass on fruit production. I was interested in frugivory, so I was conducting surveys for the different fruit production that was occurring in these two forest types. Conducting surveys over a long period, as I said, either on the ground or using canoe in the canopies. I also used fruit traps with the additional challenge of how to conduct that when the flood level was constantly rising and falling. So I had a fairly neat design using old plastic bottles, but you can see the number of these traps in a plot. That was some work to be able to establish them and then be monitoring these each month, looking at the amount of, so I've got the data on leaf litter fall, but I was primarily interested in the fruits that were falling, what time of year they were falling from different species, and so on. And I coupled that with canopy observations using binoculars to see the timing of leaf fall, of fruit fall, fruit ripening, etc. And some of that is shown in this paper here. So this selection, and it's quite a small selection of the fruits that were truly there, but some of the sort of representative samples of some of the interesting photos that I took from those samples. And you can see how some of those, the timing of unripe to ripe fruits, fruits that I was recording from the ground surveys, how they all relate to rainfall and that flood pulse, that annual flood pulse over that year's period. So that was an interesting look at the phenology and how that varied again between those two forest types. So that's shown by the grey and white spots on those figures, which I appreciate might be hard to see at this scale, but there's links to the papers, and I'm very happy to respond to emails or whatever, anything else after this. And I was, in addition, interested in those timings of fruits because I was interested in what implications that had for the animal community. And so again, this was quite an ambitious attempt, but to try and document the degree, the food webs essentially of these fruit-frugivore interactions. All these different plants, and their networks, the way in which they're connected to the animal community. So I'm sure you're familiar with food webs in general, network analysis. So the points down the middle of this plot here are all the plant genera. So this is just at genus level, in fact. So even more complex at species level. And the contrasting food web networks, fruit frugivore networks that we have in these two forest types side by side. A larger range, so the points then on either side are the animals coded by different taxonomic groups, primates, ungulates, rodents, for example. A large range of animals that depend on fruits for part of their diet at least. And you'll see that the addition of the aquatic phase during that flood period in the Varzea forests means the introduction of a new range of species, including fish, bony fish and cartilaginous fish, as well as freshwater turtles that feed on some of the fruits that are falling into the water during that period of the year. And some of the contrast again between these two forest types, that's shown by the black and white bars. You can see how the abundance of different animals changes as you move between these two forest types. And indeed, this plot doesn't do it justice, in fact, because there's obviously some migration that occurs. While some species are able to exist in the forest canopy during that flooded period, others will conduct what's described as a lateral migration as they move away from the river channel into the unflooded forests, terrestrial species primarily, that then move to the unflooded forest during the wet season. That includes groups like the ungulates, deer, for example, that will then return into the floodplain, the flooded forest, when the water descends and you get a flush of new undergrowth vegetation. Then followed, for example, then by the carnivores. So you get this seasonal migration pattern back and forth between the flooded and unflooded forests. Okay, so this frugivorous interest, I have been mainly focused on primates, or for some of my work focused on primates. So there's this sort of global review looking at the importance of fleshy fruits, but all sorts of fruits, and indeed other plant parts and animal prey, the relative contribution of these different sources in primates' diet. I've also, during my PhD, I then conducted a more focused study just on the neotropical primates, so primates across South and Central America, to think about what, reviewing the literature to see the relative contribution of all of these different components in different monkeys' diets. And you can see the major importance there of fruit, including seeds. So when it's including seeds, that's often unripe seeds. And so this is more a form of seed predation. So for example, by the Pithecine monkeys on the left-hand side, Wakari monkeys, Saki monkeys, and the bearded Sakis there, they often predate on unripe fruit, unripe seeds, and so less important in terms of seed dispersal. And it's more than that mid-range species, the atelines, including the spider monkeys, howler monkeys, that are extremely important in terms of their consumption and then of ripe fruit and dispersal, effective dispersal of seeds. So that's where that comes in, and I was interested that you can see this shown again, another set of accumulation curves, showing this time the amount of fruit genera that are consumed by different monkey species across South and Central America. And again, this is just this figure, panel A here, showing the importance of these ateline species, the spider monkeys, woolly monkeys, howler monkeys, which importantly are often these larger bodied primates. So that larger bodied, it means that they're able to consume some of the larger seeds and ingest some of those larger seeds from trees with tree species with larger seeds. They're also the most vulnerable to hunting. So bushmeat hunting in the Amazon still has a significant effect on wildlife, including primates in particular. and that has potential implications considering their importance for plant seed dispersal, and the dispersal of large seeded trees in particular can have serious consequences for future plant species composition. And this is illustrated by many studies now that are looking or trying to model, in fact, the potential future forests if we were to imagine an empty forest devoid of those larger bodied species, including those larger bodied primates, and trying to model, in fact, what the implication of, even with discounting any other changes to conditions, if you were just to remove those largest bodied animals as a response to hunting levels, what impact that could have on above ground biomass and carbon stocks. But there are many other disturbances as well, in addition to hunting, and so this next section I'll just focus on some of those. We know a lot about deforestation, fragmentation, which is, many of the similar issues that we experience here in Europe, in a sense experienced far higher levels of deforestation and fragmentation than have even occurred yet within the tropics, but huge pressures from the agricultural movement, particularly in the southern areas of Brazil, cattle ranching, soy production, but coupled as well with an increased tendency for human initiated fires, and how many of these disturbances occur synergistically. So with increased deforestation and fragmentation, that may then increase the risk from fires. So a couple of studies from the literature that demonstrate those ongoing threats. And some of those photos came from this organization, this network of researchers that I then went on after my PhD to do a postdoc with. So Rede Amazonia Sustentável, which is the Sustainable Amazonian Network, led by researchers including those from the University of Lancaster and the Museo Paraense Emilio Gheorghi in Belém, and a range of other networks. So it's a large collaborative study network, including many other Brazilian organizations, institutions as well. And this study was then focused on contrasting region of the Amazon compared to that relatively pristine, and I use that in inverted commas, pristine, there's as demonstrated, a human presence there, and has been historically for a very long time, but we don't have that same extent of deforestation and fragmentation, as you can see highlighted in pink on this map here. So this is located well within that arc of deforestation in the eastern Amazon. Large pressure from agriculture challenges, and so looking at the consequences of these disturbances, including fire and logging, for fruit functional traits. So building on some of the work that I'd done on collecting these fruits and thinking about their properties, and thinking how that connects more generally to seed dispersal processes and consequences for above ground biomass and carbon stocks. So this used a network of plots that had been established by a team of researchers led by Joss Barlow at the University of Lancaster and Erica Berenguer, Toby Gardner, and a whole team of researchers. They'd established this network of plots within 2 regions in the eastern Amazon along a disturbance gradient. So a comprehensively designed study that was making sure that there was a range of landscapes that ranged from heavily disturbed, logged and burned sites to those that had been more minimally disturbed, either logged or burned once or fewer times, a range of secondary forests that had been abandoned and then left to regenerate following those disturbances, and of course some primary forest controls as well. So a total of 230 plots across those 2 major regions, with 18 catchments in each region. So a really comprehensive study design to enable us to answer these questions. And my work was basically to compile all the data from herbarium records of these different species that have been recorded in these plot surveys, and to compile data on all the various plant traits, including wood density that I was describing previously, but also many characteristics or traits of the seeds themselves. So I mentioned the importance of primates for the dispersal of large seeded seeds. One of the really important seed traits to look at is that seed size. It has a big implication in terms of which frugivorous animals are able to consume and disperse those seeds. And I was interested in what was the effect of disturbance from logging and fire on the composition of different traits that you get in the forest there, and also how that is influenced as you get gradual recovery from clear-felled regions towards secondary forest. And by looking at what we describe as functional diversity, or the particular traits in question, we're thinking about forest function beyond those measures of forest structure. And it really gives an indication of how well that system is working in terms of seed dispersal processes, for example. And as predicted, as you might suspect, we had a very strong impact on seed size. So here on the left-hand side of the panel, you can see a decreasing seed size within forests that had experienced fires, logging, or to the middle of that picture, then those forests that had experienced both fire and logging, and a subsequent increase in seed size as you move from the right to the left, from clear-felled areas to areas of secondary forest. And you can see basically that those forests that have experienced that have recovered from clear felling to secondary forest, and this is over a period of I can't remember, 25 years, I think, on average, you're basically reaching the level of function in terms of the seed sizes, the range of seed sizes that are present in the system, reaching a system that's sort of comparable to those that experience really heavy disturbance from logging and fire. So quite profound influences from these disturbances and long-term effects on the range of seed traits that are present in the system. And so that's just for seed size, but there was a really strong correlation, as shown in this plot, between seed size, that's demonstrated here by seed width, and wood density. So that's related to the growth rate of the trees, as I described previously. So those heavily disturbed forests and those recovering from clear fell have a much lower wood density than undisturbed primary forest controls. And it forms along a very consistent gradient and a really strong correlation between that seed size and wood density. But these are just two of the plant traits that are really important. Obviously, there's many other things that you could measure in terms of the characteristics of different plant species. And so this just contributes to a much wider set of research that's ongoing in terms of the changing, documenting the plant traits that exist in different forest types, and then making the next step to see how these might change in response to any particular influences. And so we contributed the data that we had then compiled to TRI, which is a global database of plant traits that's been presented in this an updated version of this global TRI database. Then allowing us to sort of ask questions about how that varies across the Amazon. And I mentioned at the very beginning about how the Amazon forest is not homogeneous. You get these very distinct differences in the flora as you move between different regions of the Amazon, as you range across environmental gradients, for example, from east to west in terms of precipitation, in relation to soil types, and a range of other influences. But interestingly, when you think about not just variation in species richness, but how that relates to plant traits, you can see an analysis. There's basically when you look at the traits in general, two major gradients or spectra occur. One demonstrating this fast, slow spectrum in terms of growth rates, from fast growing to slow growing species, and then that also relates to seed size, and another that relates much more to leaf economics. So thinking about photosynthetic activity. But so seed size and wood density, as I've described, are often, are really important in demonstrating that first spectrum in terms of that fast, slow spectrum. And so you can see that demonstrated in the right-hand map as well, how that varies across the regions. You can see some of those floodplain forest areas highlighted in blue along some of the major tributaries of the Amazon, but also this, really distinctive regions in the northern and western regions. Interesting variation in relation to all of those different environmental variables. And so on top of that, it's really important to get that underlying baseline, and that's part of what our ongoing ABC expeditions are all about. And not just the species composition and above ground biomass, but we've got collaborators who are looking very much at these plant traits when we're collecting all of these surveys, including wood density, including some of the leaf traits. But there have been studies already that are using the data that we already have available to think about which traits are affected most by disturbances, and in fact affected positively or negatively, so winners or losers. We see that some traits are increased when you get disturbance, some decrease. So thinking of these as sort of winners and losers, and often in disturbed sites, we'll get this increase, as I mentioned from my original study, but shown more powerfully in this this review across multiple different regions and multiple different sites. You get that increase in low density woods and tree species that have those small seeds. Specifically, and I've not mentioned this before, but the seeds that are dispersed through internal gut dispersal, endozoochory of species, animals such as primates or birds, for example, that are able to ingest and then pass through the seeds intact. And the loss of extremely dense woods and large seeds that are dispersed by synzoochory. So these are animals that will be transferring seeds without having ingested them directly. So small seeds are more likely to be those dispersed by birds and by bats and some of the smaller primates. Larger seeds might be those that are not ingested whole, but will be carried, for example, and dropped. And then, some of the differences on leaf traits and maximum tree height were less pronounced than those on wood density and seed size. So that just demonstrates how valuable the information on those wood density and seed size that we've collected are for demonstrating the importance of disturbances and for thinking about what influences these might have in the future. So I think that's my main summary, just the demonstrating how much these variables change across these different forest types and in different systems, how they are influenced by different levels of disturbances, and then thinking more into the future, how they might be changed with potential changes to, for example, disturbances from flood or fire regimes, if those are altered in the future. I've got a few references from all of those studies that were mentioned. In passing, acknowledgements to the networks of groups and researchers that I've been working with across these different projects. And I'd like to say thank you very much for you all for listening. And I apologize if I've gone on a bit too long, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions now or whenever you have a chance to get in touch.
Oh, thank you so much, Joseph, for such a wide-ranging and stimulating talk and some beautiful images as well. We do have just a couple of minutes for questions, and there are two ways to ask those. Either you can click the raise hand icon and unmute your microphone and just speak your question to us, or you could type something in the chat via the chat icon. So maybe just pause for a few seconds in case anybody would like to ask a question. Perhaps I can ask one, Joseph, whilst people are just formulating theirs. I was really interested to hear you talk about this plant trait database, and I just wondered, what do you think the impacts might be of how that might be used in the future?
So there's a lot of analysis ongoing. I mean, there's constant papers coming out from researchers that are sort of mining that database, looking at functional diversity. So not just seed dispersal, but pollination and other measures of ecosystem health that you can imagine. Comparing different regions around the world, thinking about the influences of future changes or future impacts of human disturbance, and then potentially how best we can manage or adjust to these predictions. Yeah.
Thank you. And we've got a question here from David. So David, please go ahead.
Yep, thank you very much indeed. That was really, really interesting. My question was really whether in carrying out your research, how much use you make of the traditional knowledge of local people who probably understand quite a lot about the environments in which they've and their predecessors have lived for generations.
Absolutely. As much as possible. I've got one of my collaborators who I mentioned earlier, Torbjorn Haugason, is currently in Manaus, and I spoke to him earlier this week for some pre-COP meetings ahead of the COP event in Belém next month. And I'm aware through him that there's ongoing discussions about how better to incorporate, how to sort of make sure that local indigenous knowledge is included in ongoing research and new research projects. But it's extremely important, and thank you for raising it. You know, it's something that through our Instituto Juruá, we're extremely, you know, keen to include as much as possible. All of our research there is driven by local questions, local needs, particularly in relation to their interest in local resource management, sustainable management of timber and non-timber animal products. And so, yeah, we're in addition sort of hopeful. We've got plans to, well, we've set up our own reserve through the Instituto Juruá, which is to showcase some of these community-based conservation efforts we've done, but also essentially provide a reserve that is run by local people and uses that indigenous knowledge. So think of it as extremely important.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you.
And so in our ongoing sort of biodiversity surveys as well, I always made use of local people, the importance of parabotanists. They often get described in the context of the Amazon, but people who've been working with herbaria and their knowledge of the plant species diversity. I was always heavily reliant on their knowledge and expertise just in terms of identification. They often don't have an academic background and might not be able to identify necessarily to the species level, but the extremely high taxonomic level. You know, it needs corroboration, but it's an ongoing problem for plant identification in the Amazon. That it's a rather sort of aging generation of these parabotanists that are not adequately being replaced by those with expert knowledge in identification across the Amazon.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that brings us to the end of our hour tonight. Joseph, thank you again for giving up your time and speaking so eloquently about the research you've been doing. And thank you to everybody else for coming.